Hey guys, Shuldoge here. Today we are looking at the full Trashpad series, at least what I could find from Trashpad. While I couldn't find any information on when Trashpad was first founded or how experienced they are with making pads in the past, I do know that they not only make mouse pads but also mouse skates and grips, but I'm not sure if they reached any other markets besides those three. Originally they started with the Taisui and Yan, or the blue and red trash pads, and eventually made the black and the U surface, the U being the light purple surface, and gave the prior two a pro version, which includes an upgraded polyurethane base rather than the rubber one that they use for all their standard pads. Taisui is supposed to be Trashpad's take on the Artisan Zero, being a textured balanced surface. The Yan is meant to be a more controlled and smooth option to the Taisui. The black is another balance option, being Trashpad's take on the SteelSeries Standard and heavy options of the QCK, and the U is supposed to be Trashpad's very own mud pad with a very soft surface. I bought all these pads from various AliExpress stores, so I can't really recommend one in specific, though Kibu does sell the standard version of the Taisui and Yan at the time of this video. I did get the Yan in the Pro version, but not the Taisui, and I got the black in the 3mm version rather than the 6mm version that they also offer. Now, starting with Taisui, looking at a macro shot, I would say the surface weave falls somewhere right in the middle of being tight and loose, and it's very chaotic overall. It has rows of stitching similar to the Artisan Zero, but just going in the opposite direction. There is a slight bit of fraying, but it doesn't seem to be on purpose and isn't everywhere. The best way to describe how the Trashpad Taisui feels would be a denim jean Artisan Zero. It is not textured enough to be considered rough, but it does certainly have a granular feel to it without overly catching my fingers and palm. Having a very similar surface weave to the Artisan Zero, it would only be appropriate to make a comparison between the Taisui and the Zero. Like I mentioned earlier, the best way I would describe this pad to someone would be to imagine a denim jean Artisan Zero. The Taisui does perform a bit more controlled than the Artisan Zero, with the Zero feeling a bit more grainy than the Taisui, but besides those factors, these pads end up feeling very similar to use to one another. Now, looking at the properties, the static and dynamic friction of the Taisui are moderately balanced with one another when lightly gliding across the surface, but when I start to press into the pad, the static friction starts to become stronger than the dynamic friction, making the Taisui a good balance option, similar to the jack-of-all-trades that the Zero is. With the granular texture, despite the more firm rubber base, I do still feel I can come to a stop fairly easily, and I don't find myself struggling to control my mouse at any point, even with faster skates like the Magic Ice that I have on my Scyrox. While the texture stays fairly consistent between the X and Y axis, with maybe the Y axis being a tad more textured, there is a much greater difference in speed between the axes, with the y-axis feeling much slower than the x-axis. I have been impressed by the sweat resistance of this pad as it maintains its crisp texture while not grabbing at the skin during more tense play. I would say it's moderately humidity resistant, but my gut is telling me that it feels just a tad slower in a more humid environment, as it feels slowed down when I was playing in my more humid testing environment. I would call the surface of the Taisui sleeve usable rather than sleeve friendly, as it's been working decently enough with my Pulsar ES sleeve and alright with my Gamersupps sleeve. The surface can be a bit harder to keep clean as debris seems to be able to get stuck much more to this surface, which could be a result of the loose weave or the properties of the fabric used, but either way you will need to use tweezers to pick out the smaller debris out of this pad. And here's a sound test with Magic Ice dot skates to show what that texture can sound like. Now, moving on to the Yan, looking at a macro shot, the surface weave consists of a Razor Gigantus-like pattern, with horizontal rows of threads that have a decent amount of looseness and what seems like some minor fraying. The feel of the Yan surface is generally smooth with a little bit of micro texture, and I would say it's skin-friendly enough to recommend to almost anyone. It does feel like there is a bit of startup friction with skin to surface contact, but when you get a movement going, the surface feels very easy and even satisfying to glide across. I would say a mouse pad that's comparable to the Yan surface would be the ATK Blaze, as both these pads have a very similar feel and play very close to one another, with the Blaze maybe having a slight bit stronger dynamic friction than the Yawn. The Yawn does also have a slightly more micro-textured and smoother feel than the Blaze, but overall, the composition of these two pads makes me view them as being very similar to one another. Much like the Taisui, the static and dynamic friction of the Yan feel very balanced with one another, though I would say, as I mentioned earlier, that there is a much more significance when it comes to the interaction of skin to surface contact, making the static friction stronger at times, depending on how much your palm and fingers are making contact with the pad. Similar to the Taisui, the static friction also increases when pressing down. If you're able to stay relaxed and choose how much you're pressing down on the surface of the yawn, there is a lot of variability in how much stopping power you have. When you're lightly gliding across the surface with a relaxed hand, movements feel smooth without any jittering, but you're still able to press down to come to a stop when you need to. If you play tense though, you're going to be missing out on a very great aspect of this surface. There is certainly a difference in the X and Y axis, with the Y axis feeling much more textured than the X axis, in addition to the Y axis feeling slower than the X axis in general, though not nearly to the point where I'd only recommend it for horizontal movement games, though maybe fast-paced movement games like Apex might be a bigger ask. While I do have a feeling that higher humidity may have slightly made the surface of the yawn slower during testing, it never gained a muddy feeling, and in addition, the surface is fairly sweat resistant, as I didn't feel any annoying sticking that I would with surfaces that aren't sweat resistant. I would really only call the surface of the yawn sleeve usable, as it really only worked with my Kibu sleeve and I have to invert it for it to work properly at that. The surface of the yawn is fairly easy to keep clean, as while some debris does take some effort to brush off with my hand, I haven't found myself having to try and pick anything out from the weave with tweezers yet, so this pad would be great for people who don't want to spend their time maintaining and cleaning their pad every now and then. And here is an audio test with Magic Ice Dot Skates to show what that texture can sound like. Now, moving on to the black, looking at a macro shot, the weave itself is fairly consistent. There is not too much fraying. It's very similar to the weave of the Steel Series QCK, with horizontal rows of sort of leaning toward the chaotic side threads. If you've ever used the QCK, the Trashpad Black has a very comparable feeling surface to it, and I would go as far as to say that this feels like a clone of the QCK, especially with it coming in 3mm and 6mm thicknesses. For those who don't own a QCK or haven't in the past, it is a decently smooth surface with a light but coarse texture, more so on the end of being micro-textured. The Trashpad is through and through nearly identical to the Steel Series QCK surface, as they not only have identical surface weaves, but very similar feel and overall frictional values, especially with how this pad comes in 3mm or 6mm, exactly like the QCK does. I wouldn't be surprised if this pad ended up being Trashpad's take on the QCK series entirely. For the frictional properties, I do feel the static friction is a tad stronger than the dynamic friction, as I feel my movements flow very easily up until I have to change directions, in which it feels more on the snappy side. This makes it great for a lot of different scenarios, though there may be some better options for micro-tracking scenarios, specifically since it takes some effort to change directions in a small distance. For the 3mm version I'm using, the stopping power is decent, but I certainly wouldn't call it strong. With the 3mm base being on the thinner side and the lack of texture, there isn't much variability either, which, like the QCK, if you play more lower time to kill games like Valorant and CS, it may be worth considering the 6mm version of this pad, since that extra stopping power can become very effective in those types of games. But in games like Apex, 3mm is perfectly fine. While the X and Y axis do feel similar from a texture feel standpoint, I do feel the Y axis is slower and catches on the skin a tad bit more than the X axis, especially when you begin to press into the surface. I do feel like with the higher humidity comes a slightly slower surface on the Trashpad Black, but on a positive note, I haven't had any issues with my skin sticking during tense play, which means it has good sweat resistance at least. I would only call the Trashpad Black sleeve usable rather than sleeve friendly, as it works decently well with my Gamersupps sleeve, but not well enough with any of my other sleeves for me to consider using it with this surface. So if you plan to get this surface, I would hope you either have a Gamersupps sleeve or plan on going sleeveless. For some reason, this surface does seem to be a debris magnet, and one of the ideas I have for why that might be is the static electricity, as for some reason this pad is very good at producing static electricity, which became apparent while I was testing one of my sleeves on this surface. And here's an audio clip with Magic Ice dot skates to show what that texture can sound like. And last but certainly not least, we have the U. Looking at a macro shot, the weave itself is fairly tight and consistent with very densely packed rows of stitching that come together to make a very nice and clean looking pattern. However, there is a lot of fraying with this weave, which is certainly a choice by design, as it gives the surface its incredibly soft and muddy feel. The surface has an incredibly smooth and muddy feel to it, as I mentioned. Not in the way that it's sticky, but there are microfibers sticking out that slide along with your hand depending on what direction you're moving. With how muddy the U is, the only pad I could really compare this to would be the Jupiter Pro by Lethal Gaming Gear. The Jupiter Pro does just feel like a much more polished version of the U, as the fuzziness of the U can make for an inconsistent and downright annoying experience. I would say the U does feel a tad slower than the Jupiter Pro, but most noticeably has a much higher static frictional value, to the point where it's hard for me to imagine it being optimal in many scenarios at all. I do have to say the frictional values of this surface are very dependent on the skates you pair with it, as with my Ultraglide Silence, the static friction feels balanced to slightly stronger than the dynamic friction, but with my Jade Air Signature Editions, the surface feels extremely muddy, with the dynamic friction feeling the strongest I've felt in a pad. I really would recommend the Ultraglide Silence dot skates for the best experience with this pad, but as I'll discuss later, this isn't much of a surface I would recommend in general. The stopping power on this pad is very strong, and I certainly don't find myself struggling to stop on a dime, but this is more extreme to the point where I do feel myself able to have micro stutters and micro tracking scenarios, and generally makes for an extremely muddy feel. While there isn't a direct difference in the X and Y axis, movements I'm making where I direct my mouse to the right feel a bit more textured and slower than the otherwise. I think this may be due to the amount of fraying there is, which results in a sequin-like fabric, causing one direction to take more force to push the microfabrics than the other. I can't say this pad is humidity or sweat resistant, as the surface is very muddy when I was testing in a more humid environment, more so than it was already. Additionally, the surface doesn't seem to have any form of sweat dispersal, making it feel sticky as you sweat. The pad is not sleeve friendly or usable, as it isn't optimal with any of the sleeves that I test pads with. The surface is a bit harder to keep clean, as well as hairs seem to really be able to get caught in between the surface weave, and will have to be picked out with tweezers, as they certainly cannot be brushed off. And here's an audio test with Magic Ice dot skates to show what that texture can sound like. The standard version of the Trashpad series base consists of rubber and feels just about as basic as you can get in terms of it. There is not a specified listed plushness on any of the descriptions I could find for this product. The standard base is not sticky by any means and leads more toward the dry side in terms of rubber bases. The Taisui and U came to 4.4 and 4.7 millimeters thick respectively when measuring the entire thickness of the pad with digital calipers, and the Trashpad Black, which I got in the 3mm version, came out to 3.5 millimeters thick. I would say most of the standard series bases lie somewhere between soft and mid, with the U standing out, feeling more like a true mid. I would say overall these rubber bases feel similar to X-Raypad's older Aqua Control series bases, and are very bottom of the barrel overall. The adherence to the desk certainly won't be getting any worse over time, but it's not like it has much adherence to begin with, as it luckily doesn't move around too much during actual play, but I can certainly slide it around when moving my arm across the surface with moderate pressure, so you may have problems if you play more tense. The base definitely doesn't seem like one where you'd have variability in terms of pressing into it, as not only does the surface have the chances of scratching the edges of your skates, but it can be quite odd with the properties of the pad, which almost feel as though there's a pocket of empty space when pressing in, which feels fairly easy to press into before you reach the actual base, which feels much more firm. The rebound coming up is very quick and decently strong though, and while I have been able to use dots on this pad, you're going to need at least 8 or 9, as I feel at this point I would just recommend full skates with this surface or any of the other standard surfaces. The Pro version base consists of a polyurethane and doesn't have a specified firmness, but I would say it sits somewhere between soft and mid, with it feeling a bit more dense when pushing into the surface due to it being more on the firm side. The base isn't sticky, but it certainly doesn't have any issues with adhering to the desk pretty quickly when I place it on the desk, and in that regard it's certainly one of my favorites in polyurethane bases. The thickness of the entire pad measuring with digital calipers came out to just around 3.8 millimeters thick. As I stated earlier, the base plushness sits somewhere between soft and mid, and it certainly doesn't feel too plush by any means with it being how thin it is. Additionally, it doesn't feel as plush when pressing down on the surface due to how tight the surface weave is. I would say a base that's comparable to the Pro Series base in terms of plushness would be Pat Smith's or LGG's Standard Series bases. I'm a big fan of the adherence properties of this base, as despite it being on the thin side and its lack of inherent stickiness, it still manages to stay in one place during game and won't even budge when I'm tugging at the corners or edges once it does adhere. I don't have any concerns with it getting worse over time either. The base doesn't take the utmost effort to press into, but you certainly won't be pressing into it at all without trying. The rebound is fairly quick, but the rebound is really strong coming back up. Overall, the skate friendliness on this pad works out well for dots and full skates alike, as the thin base doesn't have too many issues with evening out when you do press in hard enough for something like that to happen. Now, moving on to the stitching, all the trash pads use the same stitching style with the exception of the black, of course, being edgeless. And I will mention that the Pro version certainly has the most clean edge stitching out of all the series pads. It's similar to Pat Smith's Standard Series stitching, but with a bit more girth to it. The stitching doesn't mesh too much with the rest of the base and more so feels and looks like its own part of the pad. I would say the edge stitching is a tad more soft than the rest of the base and nearly evens out with the rest of the surface when pressing down from the top. The edge stitching doesn't quite fall below the surface and has some variability around the edges on whether it falls at or above the rest of the surface. Either way, you will definitely feel your mouse cross the edge with dot and donut skates alike. Moving on to quality, as for the surface, none of the surfaces are coated and none of them feel any different to when I first got them. There doesn't seem to be any spots on the surface of any of these pads where the speed changes, with the exception of the U, which due to its unique velvety strands, there is a lot of inconsistency to be had depending on if you're moving in the same direction as the threads are leaning or in the opposite direction. I'm not sure if these pads were heat pressed or had any sort of printing treatment done, as the surfaces do feel fairly natural and there doesn't seem to be any signs showing that the colors were printed onto the surface. There doesn't seem to be any discretion on how the pads are described and how they perform as well. They all match their descriptions, though I do wish there was more info on them rather than the 1 out of 10 ratings that they give for each category. There is a logo in the bottom right corner of each surface and is raised, so you can certainly feel your fingers glide across it, as well as your skates, but I haven't had any issues with it affecting my performance as far as that goes. The surface weave alignment on all 4 surfaces is very good and pretty close to perfect on some of them, so I have no complaints as far as that goes. As for the base, I don't feel any bumps or air pockets in any of the pads bases, but the rubber bases of the Standard Series can feel a bit uneven sometimes with its lack of adherence, opening opportunities for the base to become slightly raised when pressing down into the surface. The dimensions of all 4 pads match the 480 by 400 millimeters described and are fairly even all the way around, with only some minor imperfections, more notably on the Standard Series pads rather than the Pro Series. The base on both the Standard Series and the Pro Series feel fairly even all the way around the pad, and while there was some warping when the pads came in rolled initially, they did eventually settle out, becoming mostly flat again. The stitching is fairly even on all 4 pads, and most notably the Yan Pro looks very clean to the point where I'd use it as an example of what to follow. The implementation for where the stitching meets is on the top left corner on all 4 of these pads, and is fairly clean with a more fuzzy feel where it cuts off, leading me to believe that there wasn't any treatment done like gluing or trying to burn the threads to seal it into place. There does seem to be some light fraying with the stitching where I placed my arm on top of, but not to the point where I'd have an extreme amount of concern with it wearing over time. Now, moving on to customer experience, Trashpad doesn't seem to have a website or anywhere you can find to reach out to a customer service, which means you'll have to take your questions to Kibu or the AliExpress sellers, which can be problematic because they aren't obligated to help you or answer your questions in any way. Much like the customer service, the Trashpad brand doesn't have any social media which you can keep up to date, nor does it have a community on Discord or other platforms where you can talk to other customers of Trashpad, making this sort of a niche pad that only a few actually know about. The purchasing experience was fine enough, and I imagine if you don't like the slow shipping rates of AliExpress or want whatever original packaging would be included with this pad, you could purchase these pads on Kibu in exchange for an increase in price and less options, seeing they only have the Taisui and Yan in the standard versions only and not the pro versions. Now, moving on to price. Prices can be variable on these pads, seeing they don't have a dedicated list price, but I bought each of these pads somewhere around the margin of 20 bucks, with the pro version not costing that much more than the standard, and even sometimes cheaper than the standard version, which was the case for the Yan Pro that I got. I can't confirm exactly how these pads are packaged, as on the Kibu website it shows a flat and roll-up box, but doesn't discern which one you'll actually get. But if you buy them on AliExpress, they will most certainly be rolled up without the original packaging. None of the pads came with any extra accessories, and while I would say the Taisui and Yan are worth the price, especially if you get them in the Pro version, which do indeed have steal potential at that point. While the black I would consider to be fair, but I can't say the U feels really worth it at any price, seeing how unusable it is in my experience. In conclusion, I would recommend the Taisui to someone who wants the experience of the Artisan Zero without the high price point, the Yan to someone who wants a smoother and more controlled option to the Zero, the black to someone who wants a balanced surface or just the closest you can get to the SteelSeries QCK, and the U to someone who truly wants the most unique mud pad possible. I would rate the pads as follows, with the Taisui being an 82 out of 100 for the standard, or an 87 out of 100 for the pro, the Yan an 83 out of 100 for the standard, or an 88 out of 100 for the pro, the black being a 78 out of 100, and the U being a 53 out of 100. I would buy from Trashpad again, but I can't say I'm sure if they're going to be releasing any new mouse pads in the near future. And with that being said, thanks so much for watching. Bye bye.